today is we're going to look at what you need to do before you start writing. Okay, so what you need to look at. And then we're also going to write a model answer together. Okay, so we're all going to contribute and we're going to write an answer together, and we're going to learn how we can plan for our essay. Okay, so all of those we will do today. That's good. So before we look at the static chart that we're going to write together, we're just going to look at a different example, and we're going to look at the different things that you need to check before you start writing. Okay, so this is part of your planning, and it's very important just to spend a couple of moments just to make sure that you understand what the chart is about. Okay, what the measurements are, what the key corresponds to, sorry. So there's a lot of people who make mistakes in terms of, you know, the measurements and things like that, and that's going to lose you a lot of marks in the task achievement. It's Annalie. My name is Annalie. Okay, so the kinds of things that you need to look at before you start writing. Okay, so do check the task question carefully. Okay, you need to know exactly what the chart represents. It's quite easy to, you know, write something that's not exactly accurate. Okay, so do check that. Okay, and then check all of the information that you have related to the chart and the keys. Okay, so look at the title, also look at the axes. So here we have the years down at the bottom, so we're measuring in years, and if we look at the other axis, we are measuring in thousands. Okay, this is really important because that tends to be where people make the mistake. You know, is it a percentage? Is it millions? Is it thousands? Is it just the number? But you do need to look at that very, very carefully. And again, if we look at the key, so we've got two groups that we are talking about here. We've got the temporary and the permanent. So, you know, just spend a couple of minutes checking all of those areas first, maybe highlighting some of the things that you want to make sure you remember, like the measurement for the numbers. Then you're going to start writing. Okay. So we're going to check that now with some true-false sentences. Okay, so I'm going to put some statements up, the kinds of statements that somebody might write in their task one answer. And I want you to tell me if the information is true, factually true. Okay, very good. So we're there on the first one. So yes, this is false. We are talking about immigration. We are not talking about emigration. Okay, so that's something just to be careful with. Okay, have a look at the second one. Is that correct or is it not correct? Okay. That one is correct. Yes, so we're talking about the number. They're both workers, they're immigrating, and we have the time scale is correct. Okay, so remember we're talking about people coming into the country. Okay, how about the next one? Be careful with this one. The total number of immigrants, 1992. Was 54,000. Okay, very good. Okay, so this is only talking about workers here. Okay, we're not talking about people who came to study or to retire or any other reason. So you need to put that in your essay. You need to say that these are workers. Okay. Okay, how about the next one? Okay. All right, very good. Yes, so we're comparing those who are coming permanently to work, those are coming temporarily. Okay, so that is, we are comparing two groups here. Okay, what about, so again, we're looking at 1992 here. We're looking at permanent settlers. Again, be careful, be careful. Yes, okay, why is it false? Why is it false? What's incorrect here? Okay, so yes, remember what I was saying before. So the measurement is in thousands. It is not a percentage, okay? But trust me, a lot of people get that wrong, okay? So that is really something to pay attention to, okay? Okay, what about that one? We're talking about 1995. We're talking about altogether. The number of foreign, okay, good. That is false. So why is it false? Hi, Mehdi. It's false. Why is it false? What's the incorrect information in that case? It's not really thinking about the number because we're putting the numbers together. So together that comes to about 34,000. However, we are talking about the numbers that immigrated in that year, okay? We are not talking about all of the foreign workers in Australia. That would include everybody who had come before then as well, okay? So it's not the number of workers in the country, it's the number of workers coming to the country in that year, okay? So I know that seems like quite a small difference, but it's the kind of thing that can lose you marks in task achievement because the information is not accurate, okay? All right, then we have one more. So again, we're looking at 1992. We're looking at temporary workers. We're looking at people entering the country. Okay, so here everything is correct, okay? The numbers are correct. The type of worker is correct. The fact that they're emigrating is correct. The year is correct. So that's, you know, a very, very accurate sentence, okay? So, you know, do be careful. It's quite easy to say something that isn't exactly factually correct when you look at the chart, okay? So as I said, we're spending a few minutes just looking at that, okay? We've got one last one there for the last year. So we're comparing the temporary to the permanent, and we're using a comparison phrase. Okay, exactly. It's the other way around. Okay, the temporary workers, it's the highest number for 2001. Okay, so very important just to do that. Be very, very careful with the keys, with the task question, and make sure that you're, you know, factually writing that is correct. So it's not just grammatically correct, but it's also factually correct. And pay particular attention to the measurements of the numbers, okay? Is it thousands? Is it millions? Is it a percentage? That's the kind of thing that is often done incorrectly, okay? So this is the one that we are going to write together, okay? So as we said, it's a static chart. We don't have a timeline here, okay? We're only talking about one specific year. So again, you know, we're going to look at these different things, okay? So what's the question talking about? What are we looking at in this chart, first of all? Okay, what is the comparison? Okay, so we're comparing different regions, and different regions in terms of what? Okay, so yeah, immigrants from those regions into Australia. Okay, and how are we measuring those numbers? What's our measurement? Okay, yes, in this case, we're using a percentage. Usually with a pie chart, it's a percentage, but it's not always. Okay, so we're going to be writing our answers using percentages. Okay, and what year are we talking about here? Okay, yeah, so 1991, so 1 year in the past. That's also very important to pay attention to. Okay. So what we're going to look at now is the structure that you need to use for your task 1 question. And actually it's the same structure, whatever the type of task is. So it could be a diagram, it could be a map, it could be a pie chart. Actually, your structure is always going to be the same. So you're going to start with your introduction, which is 1 paragraph. Then overview is your 2nd paragraph. We will look at all of these individually, okay, in a moment. Then you have your body, okay. If you can, it's quite good to split the body up into 2 different parts, because it's easier for the examiner to read it that way, okay. Paragraphs are not as important as they are in the task 2, where they are really, really, really important. But it makes it easier and simpler for the examiner to read when you split it up. Okay, so think of a logical way to divide the body. You can also put your overview at the end. That's totally fine. Okay, but if you do it after the introduction, it means that it's done. And you've completed that, because that's probably the most important part of your answer. Okay, so I would suggest following this structure, but if you put the overview at the end, that will be okay as well. Okay. So what we're going to do now is go through each part individually. So the introduction is basically just the task question, but you don't want to take the words exactly as they are in the task question. One, that shows that you are depending on that vocabulary instead of using your own vocabulary. But also, if you take the task question and put it in your answer, that will not be counted in your word count. And you may find that you're actually under the word count when you think you've written more than 150 words. Okay, so very important that you don't use the same vocabulary that's in the task question, but that you use some kind of paraphrasing. Okay. Yes, as we said here, you don't need to paraphrase everything. Clearly in Australia in 1991, it's perfectly fine to say that exactly the same. And also remember that paraphrasing is not just synonyms, because sometimes people kind of try too hard to use a synonym or keep using synonyms, and they end up using something that doesn't really work. But yes, Omar, exactly. You can use grammar as well. So you can change the form of the word, you can change from active to passive, passive to active. Then I'll answer that in a minute, Rowan. So, you know, you're using grammar and vocabulary to paraphrase, but don't end up writing words that aren't accurate for the sake of using a synonym. Okay, that's actually going to lose you marks. row impact, sometimes you have 2 diagrams, sometimes you have 1. We do actually have another webinar where we look at when you have 2 diagrams and you have to talk about both of those together. But similarly, in many cases, you just have 1. Okay. So yes, lots of really good paraphrasing people are using there. Okay. And don't list too many things. Sometimes what people do is they just like list all of the categories in the introduction. That's actually taking you quite a long time to do that. If you think you had to write Europe, Asia, New Zealand, etc. And it's not really getting you any points. So it's not necessary to list all of the categories in the introduction. Okay. So yes, instead of chart, we could, for example, as Juyen, quite a few have written already, Salah 2, you've got to write pie chart, okay? Instead of shows, quite a few people have already put depicts or illustrates, works very well, okay? Those are enough, you know, you're only going to write 1, so that's fine. You could say indicates as well. Instead of proportion, we could use, okay, very good. So you could say the number of, or you could say the percentage of. Number is fine. You could say ratio, that would work as well. And then here we've got immigrants and working. So we can kind of put that together, or we can change the word form in that. Okay, yeah, that works. Okay, so yeah. Foreign workers, immigrant workers, we've used the expression workforce, but workers works fine. Portrays it's okay, it's a little bit poetic, actually. I would go with depicts or illustrates. That's probably the best one. Travelers is a different meaning, so yeah, don't use travelers. But in this case, what we're doing is we're taking the working, the verb, and changing the form of the word rather than using a synonym. Okay, so, you know, in somewhat times, that's going to be the best way of paraphrasing. Okay, not movers. Movers are people who help you move house, so that's a different meaning. Foreigners is okay, Uzi, but remember that you also have to include the fact that they are working somewhere in your introduction. Okay, so it's not enough on its own. Relocating, Antonella, that's very good. Relocating for work or relocating to work in Australia. Yeah, okay. And here, you know, rather than say various, we've just said 6 different regions, okay? Different areas and nations, that would work well. Different countries and continents, you know, there's different things that you could use there, okay? And as you've already, different geographical locations, that would be fine, different places, okay? Yeah, those are all good. And as we mentioned, in Australia in 1991, we don't need to do anything with that, okay? So sometimes synonyms work best, sometimes grammar works best in terms of the paraphrasing, okay? But that's it, that's your introduction. 1 sentence, it's very rare that you would need to write more than 1 sentence for the introduction, okay? No, I said countries and continents, Edward. So, you know, you'd have to have both, yeah. You don't need to write more than that. You don't need to list the different categories. That is perfectly fine as an introduction. It's not too short because you want to have lots of time and lots of detail in your body. So really the introduction, there's not really any points that you can gain from the introduction. You just have to have enough there. So all you do is you take the task question and you change some of the words, okay? That's it. 1 sentence, maybe 2 if you had 2 different diagrams, but it's really not necessary to write more. Yes, it is okay. I wouldn't be giving it as an example if it wasn't okay. And you won't have 3, so you don't need to worry about that. Okay, really, introduction, very short, very quick. You don't want to be wasting time on your introduction. There are no marks to be gained. It just needs to be there. Okay. So now we're going to move on to the overview. So the overview really is very important, but again, it's quite short. Okay. So yeah, the overview is where you talk about the key patterns. So if you could only say, 2 things about this pie chart, what would you say? What are the things that strike you the most when you look at it? I think we can see very clearly here that the red segment, yeah, exactly, Europe is, hugely, more considerable than all of the other ones. So, that's clearly something you're going to say. So kinds of things that you're putting in the overview are the biggest numbers, the smallest number, what trends are the same, and if there are any exceptions. So in some cases, for example, if you think about a line chart, everything could be going up, but then maybe one is going down. So you need to highlight the fact that there's one that's behaving differently to the others. Okay. So high points, low points, patterns that are the same, and exceptions to those patterns. Okay. One of the things that the examiner is looking for the task achievement is that you have separated very clearly the key patterns, which you put in the overview, and the detail and the figures, which you put in the body. Okay. If the examiner cannot see the division, the separation between those 2 things, you will get a low mark for task achievement. Okay, so make sure there are no figures, no details in the overview. Okay, so let's have a look at this together. So clearly, as we saw there, the highest number by far is Europe. Okay, so definitely we're going to have to include that. Yeah. And Asia and, perhaps New Zealand, those are the next numbers. They're quite significant as well. They're quite big numbers. Okay. And then everything else is a very small number. So we can kind of group those small numbers together. Okay. Okay, now this is really, really important. In this particular pie chart we're looking at now, we don't have that many figures. So we can talk about all of them. It's easy to talk about all of them in the 150 words. However, sometimes, particularly with tables, you could get a lot of numbers, yeah? Far too many numbers to write about in 150 words. So if you have a lot of numbers, make sure that you group them together and you talk about groups rather than individual numbers. Otherwise, you will end up just listing figures, and that will not get you a good mark. Okay, so if you have a lot of numbers, put them together. If they have similar figures, they can be talked about as one group rather than individually. So that's really, really important. Here we only have 6 groups, so it's not going to be difficult to talk about all of them here. Okay. So let's have a look at what we're writing. So how do we need to begin our overview? Yes, very good, Neo, thank you. Yeah, overall. You're only going to write one, so just use overall. You don't need to think about it then, yeah? It makes life a lot easier, okay? And then we can say, yeah, so evident, clear, those, it can be seen, things like that. So these introductory phrases are very useful for the overview. Also, you can use them in the body, but they're particularly useful in the overview. Okay. So how are we going to fill that in? We need a noun here. We need a noun. We used it in our notes. Okay, very good. The majority of immigrants, okay? Or you could say the largest number, but you have to have a noun here. Yeah, the biggest. If you can avoid using big, I would avoid using big. Use large instead. It's just a little bit more academic, okay? Oh, overwhelming majority, Divya. I like that very much. That's very good. Highest percentage, anything like that. So we start with the biggest number. Okay, then we're going to move down to the next. Okay, so we can say made up a significant. Very nice, Ria. Okay, percentage, proportion, both of those words work very, very well. Okay. And then if we make a kind of comparison then between the larger numbers and the smaller numbers. Okay, very good. While or whereas work perfectly, exactly the same. Okay. So again, it's quite short. Okay, it's 2 sentences, but all of the key information is there. Okay, and we haven't put any detail. So that is very, very important. We're just putting the really obvious features that we can see, the key patterns. Okay. So that again is really, really important. It's also very important to put your overview in a separate paragraph. Okay, make sure that it's easy for the examiner to see this is the overview, and then they can give you a very high score for that. Okay, so introduction, 1 sentence, overview, 2 sentences, only the key features. Okay.